I read today from the Gospel of John, and if you're even a casual reader, you notice that John is completely different in the way that it's written than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke depict Jesus as kind of a living, breathing person, and they tell vignettes and stories about him. But then you get to the Gospel of John, and Jesus becomes suddenly very stylized. One of my professors, Ray Brown, probably the best scholar on the Gospel of John, used to say that he thought that the Gospel of John was written like icons. Icons you would see in any Orthodox church, Eastern Orthodox church, and they typically are in prayer alcoves, kind of like the way our stained glass windows are. And in the East, they believe that icons are kind of portals. So you pray to them, and then you listen back, and you hear God's communication to you as prayer is being answered. And sometimes when Jesus speaks in the Gospel of John, you hear back kind of the meaning of what Jesus is about, as well as what actually probably took place. And that's sort of typical today. John 17 through 23. Your word is the truth, so let this truth make them completely yours. I am sending them into the world just as you sent me. I've given myself completely for their sake so that they may belong to the truth. I don't pray for just my followers, but also everyone else who will have faith because of what they say. I want them all to be one with each other, just as I am one with you, and you are one with me. I also want them to be one with us. I am one with them, you are one with me, so that we might all be completely one. In this way, they will know that you sent me. You walk up and up to Jerusalem. It's on the top of a small mountain. It's 3,500 feet on one side, but if you come from the south or from the east, it's 5,000 feet to go up on the other side. And once you get there, the Temple Mount is the highest point in the city. 3,000 years ago, Solomon built a temple there because it was already a pilgrimage site for longer than anybody could even remember. There's a rock there where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac. And over that rock, they built the first temple. And the first temple was destroyed 500 years later, and then rebuilt by the Romans just before Jesus was born. And then it was destroyed again by the Romans. And today what remains is the Western Wall, the foundations of that Temple Mount. And on top of it, the Muslims have built a mosque. And just on the other side of the mosque is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that has altars at one end at the place where Jesus was crucified on Golgotha, and a tomb on the other end where Jesus was resurrected. And every day, thousands of people, and on some days, tens of thousands of people walk up to the same areas to pray. And they bring the concerns of their hearts. They bring people that cannot be healed. They bring situations of conflict and frustration that can't seem to be resolved. They bring their disappointments and their griefs. They bring their distant hopes for integrity in their own nation and for peace across our world. All three faiths believe that Jerusalem is one of the thin places where we are close to God. Our prayers go from our lips immediately to God's ear. And there's something plaintive and humane about the sound of all these people turning towards God, making their hearts known, seeking God's blessing, usually praying for people that have asked them to pray for them that are thousands of miles away. So many people opening themselves to God, connecting with people that they love. It's moving how interconnected our world can actually become. An Orthodox rabbi once told me a story of Jewish lore about a man whose son had gone out in the world to find himself. And the son traveled far, far away to the east, to India. And he tried this religious tradition, he tried that religious tradition. Eventually, he started smoking opium. He becomes poorer and poorer. He becomes addicted to opium, and his life just starts to dissipate. He never communicates with his family. And each month, his mother and his father become more and more worried about him, more anxious about what happened to him, and guilty that they haven't been good parents. And finally, the father decides to make a trip to Jerusalem to go to the wall and ask God to redeem his son. He gets to Jerusalem, goes down to the western wall, and writes a prayer to God that says this on a little scrap of paper: God, I will do anything, anything, anything you ask, if you'll send my son Avi back to me and his mother, because we're afraid for him and we want him to know that we love him. And he rolls it up and he sticks it in the cracks with the millions and millions of other prayers that are stuck in the cracks between the stones. And his son, meanwhile, is getting sicker and sicker and sicker, and realizes one day that if he doesn't go home, he is certainly going to die here in this far country. And so he decides to start making his way back to his home. And as he's going home, he passes by Jerusalem. And he decides to stop. And he goes to the Wailing Wall. And he gets there and he's surprised, because even though he's aimless and despairing, and he thinks his life is worthless and without meaning, at the same time he remembers, that he's a Jew. And he hears all these prayers that he's heard as a child from people all around him reading out of the prayer book in Hebrew. And he touches his hands to the wall and he remembers his grandparents and all of the suffering that they have had in this life. And suddenly he can imagine them so clearly. And he's filled with emotion as he's making a connection through his people and their suffering to the great transcendent force that courses through the universe. And he feels compassion welling in his heart that has been empty for so long. He thought he was dying and almost dead. And he sees all these tiny pieces of paper wedged in the cracks, some of them so old, and he can't help himself. He runs his hands over those pieces of paper with their prayers on them, and a few of them fall out of the cracks onto the ground. So he picks them up and starts putting them back into the cracks. And with the last one, he can't help himself. He just wants to read what they wrote. And he slowly opens it and he reads, God, I will do anything, anything, anything you ask, if you'll send my son Avi back to me and his mother, because we're afraid and we want him to know that we love him. We are connected, and our whole world is but 6 degrees of separation from one end to the other. And we possess this transcendent capacity through the spiritual profundity of love to connect in mysterious, seemingly miraculous ways, such as the power of faith to heal each other, such as the power to bless one another and bestow meaning and purpose, such as the power of faith to redeem us and help us all, however lost we are, to find our way back to our authentic home. The burgeoning question of our day is how religious people in every major faith tradition will find a way to express inclusive understanding and facilitate cooperation so that we might develop an interfaith ethos of acceptance and social harmony that encourages reconciliation and the peaceful resolution of violence and conflict. I leave aside Hinduism and Buddhism this morning and just lift up the 3 religious traditions of Abraham, the people of the book. Muslims call us that, the people of the book. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we constitute over half the world's population. And out of one original vision, where Abraham concluded that God was primarily a God of mercy and compassion and blessing, we have 3 different religions, and all of them are ultimately called to unity, just like our passage this morning, where Jesus is asking us to be truly one. And the vision of God and the vision of a holy spiritual life are remarkably similar in all 3 faiths. In Judaism, God brings the people out of Israel from slavery to freedom. God hears their cries and is merciful towards them and compassionate, slow to anger, in the words of Deuteronomy, and steadfast in love towards us. And God gives us a moral way to live in the 10 Commandments. And these, the Jews kept in the Ark of Covenant, and they put that Ark of Covenant in the most holy part of the temple. Orthodox Jews actually count 613 commandments that God has given us as a guide for how to live a life with integrity and spiritual purpose. And Jesus also teaches us that God is fundamentally love and compassion, and that we should do unto others as others we would have them do unto us, a spiritual maxim that summarizes the Ten Commandments. And like Judaism, Christianity is a social faith. It's about community. So we lift up the importance of forgiveness and reconciliation in the pursuit of a social life and a family life that leads towards harmony and peace. And Jesus models for us, particularly during Lent, the way of humility that looks to others, fulfilling them first, so that we reflect God's love for the world, and through that we access the higher ways of living. And Islam refers to God as Allah the compassionate and Allah the merciful. And when Muslims greet you, they say Salam Alaikum, which means peace be with you. And you're supposed to respond, Wa Alaikum Salam, which means, and unto you peace. It's the same thing we Christians say to each other each and every Sunday in church. And they too believe that the way of humility opens our ego to being transformed, to allow our higher selves to bud. So the faith is referred to as Islam, which means submission, as in submission to the way of God. And they pray 5 times a day, prostrating themselves on the ground to remember that they are not the center of the world, but that God is. And they are also required, like we are, to give to the poor and the destitute, to reflect the compassion and love that Allah has for people in this world. But we are not one. And religion is used far more as a source of continued division than as a resource for inclusivity, especially by the Orthodox in every tradition. And it's largely because the Orthodox in every tradition spend way too much energy on defending the authority of the messenger rather than the intrinsic authority of the message that they brought. So we always end up creating this inside and outside. We follow the true prophet and you don't. And it creates and maintains the faithful versus the heretic, the true believers versus the infidels, the righteous remnant versus the corrupt, sinful world. And for Orthodox Jews, it's Moses, or keeping kosher, that identifies the religiously genuine. So they say that if we could just keep all of the commandments of Moses for one day, the Messiah would come and we would all be redeemed. Or in our gospel in John, the verses that I read at the very end, that we might believe, that they might believe you sent me. In John, over and over, Jesus is the way and the truth and the life, and no one goes to the Father except through him. It's not enough just to point to the message. You have to see the authority of the messenger as well, the Son of God. Jesus is not only depicted as sinless in the Orthodox faith, his mother Mary is also depicted as sinless as well, in order that Jesus becomes so close to God that Jesus veritably is God. And in Islam, Muhammad didn't just have insights about Allah. Every single word that was revealed to him that makes up the Quran are the very words of God. And although Moses and Jesus were mighty prophets, their teaching has been superseded so that Muhammad is the final prophet. So instead of 3 becoming 1, what we have is one message of a God living in 3 different forms of division, each pointing their finger at each other with conflicting truth claims about which messenger is more authoritative and authentic. Ironically, the bigger picture of God as love and compassion and justice and peace and unifying so that we might become one is remarkably similar in every faith tradition. And our moral vision overlaps a whole lot. We in the West are always asking Palestinians and Israelis why they can't just make the peace with each other. And then you visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre where Jesus was crucified and resurrected. Mark, if you could flip that picture up on the screen for me just now. This is just about the oldest church in existence. The floor was laid in 350 when Rome finally made Christianity no longer illegal, but they actually made it the religion of the empire. So we really don't have any churches before 350 because churches were all persecuted up until that time. This is almost the first church that was ever built. There are 6 Orthodox monasteries attached to it, and they have each been there from very early on. The Greek Orthodox, the Armenian Apostolic Orthodox, the Roman Catholic Church, the Syriac Orthodox, the Coptic or Egyptian Orthodox, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And no changes can be made to the church without the express agreement of all 6 of these monasteries. But it turns out they can't agree on much of anything, so nothing ever changes. And the casual visitor will notice that above the entrance to the church, and we circled it there in the second photo and kind of blew it up so you could see it. That first one is just the entrance to the church. That's what you would typically see. This is the same image blown up so that it becomes a little bit more obvious. You notice that above the entrance to the church, on a balcony on the second floor, there sits a cedar ladder. We can't get all 6 groups of Orthodox monks to agree to move it. No one knows exactly how long that ladder has been up there, but it appears in a graving from 1839. And we have it in a painting from 1753. 265 years is a long time to hold a grudge. But then you're dealing with 6 different groups of men that all think they have the ortho, or right, doxy, which means way to believe or way to worship. They're right, and everybody else is wrong. And if you believe that your tradition doesn't simply have truth with a small t, but the truth with a capital T, then the word compromise is synonymous with moral decadence. And all of these Orthodox monks, by the way, of course, share the same commitment to follow in the way of Jesus. That's 265 years, nothing moving. You cannot make this up. And there's Orthodox Jewish sects that are fighting with each other with the same ferocity over whether they should recognize the state of Israel or not. There's a host of other splinter issues I won't even go into, too long to list. And of course, as we speak, the Shia and Sunni Muslims are at war with each other in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, with people literally dying each and every day in almost every one of those countries. And in every case, religion is a force of division rather than unity. It adds to the intensity of hatred and the sense of grievance for revenge. And the irony is that both sides in all of these conflicts that I just mentioned all agree that the higher way to live, the spiritual way to live, the divine way to live is through reconciliation, compassion, mercy, forgiveness, and love. They believe fundamentally that we should treat one another as though we would want to be treated. And we know we need to love, but we have to be right just a little bit more. That control, the consistency, the desire for perfection, the desire to be definitively, unquestionably right has triumphed for far, far too long. And it will be transcended. It must be transcended because our world is becoming so interconnected and so interdependent that religion simply must become a force that leads us towards an inclusive quest for truth with a small t, in a way that celebrates our diverse cultural and spiritual traditions. The world is growing ever more multicultural and multi-faith. The spirituality of our time can no longer operate in parochial shtetls, little walled communities that are insular and inwardly focused. We have to be able to transcend the parts of our faith traditions that build walls of fear rather than bridges of understanding. We have to find our common human bond in taking our petitions up to God. That's more important because it binds us all together than our separate revelations as to how our distinctive religious traditions came to be developed. And we must do it not because it is the right thing to do, although it is. We must do it not because we will be more fulfilled, although we will. We must do it because our world is now too small for anything but love and understanding and reconciliation. And the genuine spiritual leaders in the next generation simply must be willing to step beyond their original traditions and create a new spiritual ethos for our time, based on the shared values that we separately hope for our children: empathy, understanding, forgiveness, compassion, reconciliation, harmony, and peace. And unfortunately, as you know, it is most likely to be born out of our shared pain, out of the mutual recognition that trauma and violence and grief deform the human spirit beyond any righteous justification for vengeance. We cannot live that way. We cannot see our children's children live this way. I want them all to be one, said Jesus, just as we are one. I am one with them, and you are one with me, that we may be completely one. And that's the goal. That's what we're all about. Amen.